HP, Reborn as Regulus Black and kills Voldemort. Chapter 11, A Reckless Confrontation. At 10:47 a.m. on September 1, 1972, Regulus Black came to a stop before the brick wall between platforms 9 and 10 at King's Cross Station. The 11-year-old was tall for his age, dressed in a dark green robe pressed to perfection. A black family crest was pinned neatly at his collar. His hair was a deep, pure black, carrying the Black family's signature slight curl. Gray eyes swept calmly over the crowd. In his left hand was a brand new dragon-hide trunk. Wahlberg had insisted on the most expensive option. In his right, a cage holding a snowy owl. The owl stood quietly inside, amber eyes observing the surroundings through the bars. Unlike the others nearby, it didn't flap or fuss, only turning its head now and then. Regulus drew a slow breath in. Beyond this wall was another world. A world he'd read about for 10 years, a world he was finally about to enter. He stepped forward. The sensation was like passing through warm mist. Then sound rushed in all at once. A living, chaotic clamor. Owls screeching in a discordant chorus. Cats yowling from baskets. Shrill cries as toads leapt from unfastened pockets. Parents shouting last-minute instructions. Children yelling so loudly their voices cracked with excitement. Platform 9 3/4. The Hogwarts Express lay along the tracks like a massive crimson beast, white steam pouring from its engine and pooling beneath the arched roof in rolling clouds. Students surged toward the doors in waves. Robes of every color blended into a shifting sea. Regulus stayed where he was, gaze sweeping calmly across the platform. He spotted the Potter family. Charles and Euphemia Potter stood not far off, wearing the gentle smiles of ordinary parents seeing their child off to school. 4 people clustered around them. James Potter stood at the front, brown hair as if it had just lost a fight with a hurricane, glasses crooked on his nose. He was flailing his arms, demonstrating something exaggerated to a thin boy carrying a battered suitcase. That was Remus Lupin. Peter Pettigrew hovered half a step behind James, short and round-faced, eyes darting nervously in every direction. Sirius Black lounged against a stack of luggage. At 13, he'd grown another inch since the previous summer, his shoulders starting to take on a young man's shape. He wore the Muggle jeans Wahlberg despised, faded from wear, frayed at the knees, paired with a plain dark shirt. Over it all was a Gryffindor robe, thrown on carelessly. The robe had clearly been altered. The silver trim at the collar had been dyed red and gold, and faint traces of an embroidered lion lingered at the cuffs. James said something, and Sirius tipped his head back and laughed. It was an easy laugh, loose and unguarded, rising straight from his chest. One arm draped over Remus's shoulder, the other gesturing animatedly. Then his eyes swept the platform and landed on Regulus. The laughter faded naturally. He didn't look away. He didn't nod or signal either. He simply watched, 20 feet apart, separated by the noise and the crowd. Then James noticed too. "Hey!" James shouted, his voice cutting cleanly through the din. "Look who it is. A little black snake slithering in early to get used to the place." Heads turned. Students and parents alike looked over. Sirius rested a hand on James's shoulder. It was light, but James immediately shut his mouth. Sirius said nothing, only shook his head. Then turned and pulled open a carriage door, climbing aboard first. James followed. Remus and Peter trailed after him. Just before boarding, James glanced back at Regulus once more, curiosity and hostility mingling in his eyes. Regulus lifted his trunk and headed toward the middle of the train. James Potter wasn't worth his attention. Inside, the Hogwarts Express was more spacious than it appeared from the outside, a textbook application of the extension charm. A deep red carpet lined the corridor. Sliding doors stood on either side, most already closed, voices and laughter leaking through the seams. Regulus moved quietly along the aisle. At the third carriage, a door stood open. He caught a glimpse inside. James had already shed his robe and was trying to stick a chocolate frog card to the ceiling. Peter was hunched over his luggage. Remus sat by the window with a worn copy of A History of Magic in his hands. Sirius sat across from him, boots propped on an empty seat, idly flicking a golden snitch model he'd acquired from somewhere. Sirius looked up. His gaze met Regulus's through the open door. Then he looked down again and kept playing with the snitch, as if nothing had happened. Regulus walked on. Several carriages later, most were full. Near the seventh, he spotted two familiar figures. A red-haired girl with green eyes and faint freckles. She wore a simple black robe, clean and well-kept, with a plain silver pin at her collar. Lily Evans, a second year. Beside her stood a black-haired boy with greasy hair and sallow skin. His robe was clearly second-hand and hastily altered, the cuffs worn thin. Severus Snape, also a second year. They were speaking in low voices. Snape leaned forward as he talked, words tumbling out quickly, fingers tracing shapes in the air. Lily listened intently, nodding now and then. As Regulus passed, Snape glanced up. He noticed the trunk in Regulus's hand. The owl cage. The finely tailored, expensive dark green traveling robe. His lips pressed together slightly. Something sharp flickered through his eyes, a mix of hostility and wariness. Then he looked away and continued talking to Lily. Regulus reached the ninth carriage. It was empty. He stowed his trunk on the rack, slid the owl cage beneath the seat across from him, and sat down. From inside his robe, he took out a notebook. He flipped to the most recent page. The relationship between ancient runic variants and magic flow efficiency. Below it sprawled dense symbols, formulas, and diagrams. Some were standard ancient runes. Most were his own refined variants. He dipped his quill and began recording the thoughts he'd had the night before. The train pulled away from London's outskirts. Dense buildings gave way to scattered farmhouses, then wide, rolling fields. The sky hung low and grey, heavy with the promise of rain. The compartment door was suddenly yanked open and slammed against the wall with a dull thud. Regulus looked up only after finishing a complex curve. He didn't need to see who it was. He'd sensed it before they even reached the door. Well, look who it is. James Potter's voice rang with theatrical exaggeration. Little Lord Black, sitting here alone, studying dark magic. Regulus didn't react. He simply watched the performance. To him, even as a second year, James Potter was no different from a child. James stepped inside. Remus and Peter followed. Remus looked uneasy. Peter clutched the door frame. Tense, as if ready to bolt. I'm talking to you. James leaned down in front of Regulus, glaring. I hear you push Sirius around at home. Play the good kid and steal all the attention, is that it? James, Remus said quietly. Don't. Don't what? James straightened, his hand already slipping toward the inner pocket of his robe. Regulus found it faintly amusing. He had no idea how Sirius had described him to his friends, for James to believe he'd been bullied. James. Sirius's voice came from the corridor. He appeared in the doorway, breathing slightly hard. He looked at James. I told you not to come. I'm just looking. James shot back. It's not like he bites. At that moment, two more figures hurried over. Lily Evans and Severus Snape. Snape took in the scene with a single glance, a curl of mockery tugging at his mouth. Lively as ever. Potter picking on first years again. James spun around. What's it to you, Snivellis? Then he noticed Lily behind him, his tone turning sharper. And you? Always sticking your nose in, Evans. Snape's face darkened instantly. His hand went for his wand. Lily grabbed his arm. Severus, don't. James was faster. Expelliarmus. A red bolt shot toward Snape. The compartment was narrow. They stood less than 10 feet apart. The spell reached Snape almost instantly. A wand slid into Regulus's left hand as if it had always belonged there. He gave the slightest flick of his wrist. No force. No drama. The spell stopped. Frozen in midair. The red light took shape, the disarming charm now a glowing ribbon, one end tethered to the tip of James's wand, the other hanging half a foot from Snape's chest, utterly still. The entire carriage fell silent. Chapter 12, Evans and Snape. James's eyes went wide, his mouth falling open. Remus sucked in a sharp breath. Peter let out a short, startled squeak before clapping a hand over his mouth. Sirius stood in the doorway, his body tense, fingers curling unconsciously into a fist. He wanted to draw his wand, but forced the impulse down. Helping outsiders gang up on his own brother, no matter the outcome, would be humiliating. Besides, he knew the truth. Even if he stepped in, he wouldn't win. Pushing things further would only make it worse. Severus Snape stared at the frozen red ribbon of light. Slowly, he turned his head and looked at Regulus. Lily was still gripping Snape's sleeve, though she no longer seemed aware of it. She was simply staring, stunned. Regulus finally looked up. He glanced at James, his gaze as indifferent as if he were looking at a piece of furniture. Then he turned his attention to the red ribbon. His right hand still held the quill. His left hand lightly gripped the wand, giving it the smallest lift. The red glow dulled. From vivid to faint. From solid to translucent. Then it broke apart, like ice melting, dissolving into countless tiny red motes. They drifted, spun once in the air, and vanished without a sound. The process wasn't fast, and it wasn't slow. Everyone saw it clearly. The wand disappeared from Regulus's hand as abruptly as it had appeared. His left hand returned to the desk. He lowered his head and continued writing, the quill scratching steadily across the page. As if nothing at all had happened. The silence dragged on for at least 10 seconds. James Potter still had his wand raised, his posture stiff, like a statue. His eyes were stretched wide. Behind his lenses, his pupils reflected empty air. 10 seconds ago, a complete disarming charm had been halted, dismantled, and erased, as if it had never existed. You. James's voice caught. He swallowed, his throat bobbing. What did you do? Regulus didn't answer. He didn't even spare James another glance. James clenched his fist, clearly wrestling with himself. He was furious at being ignored, but in the end, he didn't explode. Because he knew. Or rather, he'd learned enough to know. There was a brief note in the appendix of Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1. In theory, a sufficiently powerful wizard could interfere directly with another's magic and collapse the structure of an inferior spell. The more you knew, the more terrifying that idea became. James Potter loved pranks. He was arrogant. He was biased against Slytherin. But he wasn't stupid. His father had taught him basic spell theory. He'd seen adult wizards cast advanced magic. He read books. So he understood that what had just happened wasn't a first year pulling off a clever trick. It was something far beyond his imagination, unfolding right in front of him. And the one who had done it sat there quietly, as if he were no more important than a passing insect. James's grip tightened around his wand, the wood digging into his palm. He wanted to throw out a taunt, anything to save face, but his mouth was dry. Not a single word came out. What was that spell? Remus asked softly, shifting to place himself in front of James. It wasn't a spell, Sirius said. He stepped into the compartment and stood beside James, his eyes on Regulus. He hadn't expected Regulus to have reached this level already. He knew what it implied, and the realization left him tangled in thoughts he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was some family secret he didn't know about. What do you mean? James snapped, turning on him. I mean you can't beat him, Sirius said, keeping his voice deliberately even. Caught between his friend and his brother, he refused to take sides openly. Then he added, at least not right now. So don't provoke him. James opened his mouth, ready to argue. Then he looked at Regulus, then at the spot where the spell had vanished. In the end, he said nothing. Regulus finally looked up at Sirius. He gave a slight nod, then lowered his gaze again. They left. Out in the corridor, Lily Evans and Severus Snape were still standing there. Lily had let go of Snape's sleeve, but she hadn't moved away. Her eyes were wide as she glanced between Regulus and the place where the spell had disappeared. Snape's expression was darker than usual. He stared at Regulus, his eyes full of wariness. Are you all right? Lily asked first. Regulus looked up, his gaze passing over both of them. Thank you for coming, he said. Strictly speaking, though, it's Mr. Snape who deserves thanks. The spell was aimed at him. Lily blinked, clearly not expecting that. Still, it was true. Oh. I mean, it's nothing. Snape's mouth twitched. He kept staring. How did you do that? Regulus didn't answer. Instead, he stood and introduced himself. Before that, perhaps we should know each other properly. I'm Regulus Black. Black. Lily's eyes widened slightly. You're Sirius Black's brother. Regulus gave a small nod, his right shoulder and hand angling outward just a bit. I'm Lily Evans. Having that confirmed made the name hit differently. She took a quiet breath. Then her tone grew a touch more formal. Second year, Gryffindor. This is Severus Snape, also a second year. Slytherin. Snape pressed his lips into a thin line and nodded stiffly. Regulus inclined his head to both of them. I know your names. Lily blinked. You do. Professor Slughorn mentioned you, Regulus said, as casually as if stating a fact. He said there are 2 second-year students at Hogwarts whose talent in potions far exceeds their peers. Lily Evans and Severus Snape. He suggested that, if I had the chance, I should talk with you. Lily's face flushed. Her eyes lit up, and a genuine smile spread across her face. Really? Professor Slughorn said that. Snape's expression was more complicated. His chin lifted slightly, pride flickering there, but caution still lingered in his eyes. He'd heard praise like that before. Talent beyond one's peers often came with an unspoken addition in Slytherin. But your blood doesn't match it? So you knew who we were, Snape said, his voice tight, steering the conversation back. Then what we just saw, that wasn't something a first year should be able to do, Mr. Black. Regulus met his gaze. He knew what Snape was like at this age. He was sensitive, insecure and proud. A bundle of contradictions. Wary of purebloods, yet secretly longing to belong among them. Spell analysis and magical interference, Regulus said. The principles aren't complicated. They just demand extremely fine control. And magic perception. How fine? Snape pressed. Sensitive, insecure, proud, and rude, Regulus noted to himself. Still, Snape was valuable. Fine enough that most adult wizards can't manage it, Regulus replied evenly. I've practiced for a long time. Lily looked at him with curiosity. How long have you been practicing magic? As long as I can remember, Regulus said lightly. My family has a library. The Black family library was famous. Then again, every old family had one. But no amount of books could truly let a child master advanced magic alone. Lily accepted the explanation anyway. She was Muggle-born. She had no frame of reference for how pure-blood families educated their children. She nodded, a bit more warmth in her eyes. So you're the type who likes studying too? Studying is necessary, Regulus agreed. For wizards, knowledge is power. And for Muggles, even more so. That made Snape's brow lift slightly. He glanced at Regulus, the wariness in his eyes easing, replaced by a measure of agreement. So, Snape asked, which house are you going to? Slytherin, Regulus answered without hesitation. It's a family tradition. Lily's expression dimmed for a moment. She glanced at Snape, then back at Regulus. Her lips moved, then she said, Slytherin, isn't so bad. Severus is there. And in her mind, she added, but there are also a lot of people there who hate people like me. Regulus understood. He simply nodded. Every house has people worth learning from. And people not worth your time. That brightened Lily immediately. She smiled. You're right. Then, see you at the sorting. See you at the sorting. Lily tugged lightly at Snape's sleeve. We should go back, Severus. Snape gave Regulus one last look, nodded, and turned away. Lily waved before following him. The compartment fell quiet again. Chapter 13, Where the Dream Begins. At some point, the rain stopped. The clouds split apart, and the last light of sunset slanted in from the west, bathing the train car in a warm wash of orange. The outline of the Scottish Highlands had already come into view. Dark green hills rose and fell in the distance, their shapes softened by dusk. A gentle female voice sounded over the train's speakers, announcing that they were about to arrive and asking students to gather their belongings and prepare to disembark. Regulus closed his notebook and slipped it back inside his robe. The train thundered along the tracks, wheels striking steel in a steady rhythm, clank, clank, clank. They arrived at exactly 7 in the evening. The night sky was thick with stars. There was no moon, but the starlight was bright enough to illuminate the crowded platform and the rolling clouds of white steam. Cold, damp air rushed into the carriages, carrying the distinct scent of the highlands, earth, and pine needles layered with something unmistakably magical. First years. This way. A booming voice rang out across the platform. Regulus stepped down with the flow of students. The platform was packed. Older students hurried toward the waiting carriages, while the first years gathered around a towering figure holding a lantern. Rubeus Hagrid, gamekeeper and keeper of keys. He loomed like a walking hill, the lantern's orange glow lighting up his thick beard and friendly smile. Come on, then. Follow me. Watch your step. Regulus followed the group down a steep, narrow path. It wound through dense trees, the stones underfoot slick with moisture. The darkness was thick enough that he could only make out the outlines of robes ahead and the occasional swing of lantern light. The forest opened all at once. A vast, black lake stretched out before them, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the star-filled sky. And on the cliffs across the water stood Hogwarts. Towers and spires rose like a forest of stone, piercing the night. Warm yellow light glowed from the windows, as though stars themselves had been caught and set into the walls. The castle shimmered faintly under the starlight, ancient and solemn, wrapped in mystery. Like an old legend waiting to be stepped into. The first years drew in a collective breath. Someone whispered in awe. Someone else grabbed a friend's sleeve, trembling with excitement. Regulus stood at the lake's edge and looked up at the castle. He'd read about it countless times. He'd imagined it in his dreams more times than he could count. But the real Hogwarts was greater than every description, grander than every imagined version, deeper and more unknowable. It was a dream. And it was where the dream began. No more than 4 to a boat. Hagrid's voice pulled them back. He pointed toward a row of small wooden boats moored along the shore. They were plain, without oars, yet ready to move on their own. The first years began to board. Regulus ended up in a boat with 3 unfamiliar boys. One was red-haired and freckled, likely a Weasley. Another had black hair and a tight, nervous expression. The third was blonde and kept fussing with his collar. The boat glided silently toward the center of the lake. The water below was pitch black, unfathomably deep. Something moved beneath the surface, casting slow, massive shadows. Now and then, a broad fin broke the water, catching starlight with a cold gleam. "That's the giant squid," the red-haired boy whispered. Fear and excitement tangled in his voice. "My brother says it doesn't hurt anyone. It even saves students who fall in." The boat rocked suddenly. Everyone grabbed the sides. Regulus remained steady. He looked down at the water, at the drifting shadows, at the stars reflected on the surface. Then he lifted his gaze to the castle, drawing ever closer. Behind those glowing windows, he could already picture it. 4 long house tables laden with food. Older students talking and laughing. Professors murmuring among themselves at the staff table. And at the far end of the hall, a wooden stool waited. On it sat the battered Sorting Hat, ready to sing Hogwarts song in its cracked, unpleasant voice. The boats reached the shore. They climbed a flight of stone steps and stopped before massive oak doors. Hagrid raised his huge fist and knocked 3 times. The doors swung open. Professor McGonagall stood just inside. She wore deep green robes, her hair pulled into a severe bun. Her expression was as stern as if she were presiding over a trial. "Welcome to Hogwarts," she said, her voice clear and composed, carrying through the echoing entrance hall. "Before you enter the Great Hall for the sorting ceremony, there are a few things you must know." Regulus stood among the first years, listening as she explained the house system, the house cup, and the rules of discipline. His gaze slipped through the open doorway, into the hall beyond. Thousands of candles floated overhead. Students filled the 4 long tables, silverware gleaming in the candlelight, robes blending into rivers of color. Scarlet and gold. Yellow and black. Blue and bronze. Green and silver. At the staff table, he recognized familiar faces. Dumbledore sat at the center, blue eyes behind half-moon spectacles surveying the noisy students with gentle interest. Slughorn's round belly strained against his waistcoat as he smiled broadly. Tiny Professor Flitwick perched on a tall chair, chatting with the warm-faced Professor Sprout beside him. Regulus's gaze drifted to the Slytherin table. Nearly everyone sat with careful posture, doing their best to project elegance and restraint. At the Gryffindor table, James Potter sat rigidly upright, eyes fixed on the entrance. Sirius sat beside him, turned away from the doors, speaking quietly with Remus. Lily Evans sat a little farther down, animatedly talking to a dark-haired girl beside her. "Now, line up in single file," Professor McGonagall said. "Follow me." The first years nervously adjusted their robes and formed a line. Regulus stood in the middle, a sniffling girl in front of him and a boy trembling behind him. They entered the hall. Hundreds of eyes turned toward them. Whispers surged and faded like waves. Regulus could feel the weight of those looks: scrutiny, curiosity, expectation, disdain. He walked calmly, eyes forward. At the far end of the hall, Professor McGonagall stopped beside a tall stool. Resting on it was a battered, patched, pointed wizard's hat. It twitched. A seam along the brim split open like a mouth, and it began to sing. The song was old and raspy, telling the story of the 4 houses and their traits. Regulus listened, but his thoughts drifted. He thought of the train. Of James's stunned expression. Of the respect in Remus's eyes. Of Peter's frightened shaking. Of Sirius, who hadn't spoken to him. Of the stars beyond the window. The song ended, and applause rippled through the hall. Professor McGonagall unfurled a long parchment scroll. "When I call your name, step forward and put on the sorting hat." The first name was called. A trembling girl stepped up. The hat slipped down over her eyes. A few seconds later, it shouted, "Hufflepuff." Cheers erupted from the yellow and black table. One name after another. One house after another. Regulus waited. Regulus Black. The whispers swelled instantly. Almost everyone knew the name. Even Muggle-born students had heard that his brother had shattered 500 years of Black family tradition by going to Gryffindor the year before. All eyes were on him. Where would this Black go? Regulus stepped forward calmly and sat on the stool. Professor McGonagall placed the sorting hat on his head. It was large, blocking out his vision and the light. Then a faint voice sounded directly inside his mind. Another Black. Clever, very clever, far too mature for your age. What are you thinking about? Not power. Not glory, you're looking much farther ahead, very far. Regulus kept his thoughts steady. Ravenclaw would suit your mind. You have courage as well. But you seek knowledge, then perhaps the best place is. The hat drew in a deep breath and shouted, "Slytherin." The green and silver table erupted in applause. Robistan clapped first. Avery and Mulciber joined in, their expressions complicated. Boos rose from the Gryffindor table, led by James. Sirius stayed silent. Regulus stood and walked to the Slytherin table, taking a seat beside Robistan. "Welcome," Robistan said. "Thank you," Regulus replied. The Slytherins around him reached out to shake his hand. The sorting continued. More familiar names were called. More students went to their houses. But Regulus no longer paid attention. He lifted his gaze to the enchanted ceiling high above, where it reflected the night sky outside. The Milky Way stretched across it, stars scattered in endless depth. Infinite. And far-reaching. Chapter 14, The Slytherin Traditional Program. Even a culinary wasteland has its oases. Hogwarts's dinner was, by all standards, satisfying. Once the meal ended, the 7th-year Slytherin prefect, Lucretius Burke, rose from his seat and tapped his silver spoon lightly against his goblet. "Slytherin first years, with me." Regulus and the other 11 new students stood and followed him away from the long table, out through a side door of the Great Hall, and down a long spiral staircase of stone. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. The walls shifted to smooth black marble, and the torches burned with an eerie emerald flame. They stopped before a bare stone wall. The only decoration was a roughly carved stone serpent. The prefect turned to face them. "I am Lucretius Burke, 7th-year prefect." His gaze passed over every face, lingering a moment longer on Regulus. "Welcome to Slytherin. Before we enter, there are a few things you need to understand. First, Slytherin values bloodline, ambition, and intelligence. You need all three. Second, loyalty is paramount. Loyalty to your own. Your roommates and housemates will be your most reliable allies, or your most dangerous enemies. Third, Slytherin has no patience for weakness. Tears and tattling will only make you a joke." His eyes swept back to Regulus. "And finally, remember this. What happened with the Black family last year brought shame to Slytherin. This year, we expect someone to restore that reputation." The implication was barely disguised. Several first years glanced toward Regulus. Regulus remained calm and said nothing. He already knew there would be a performance tonight. The prefect turned to the stone wall and said clearly, "Glory." The stone serpent's eyes flared red. The wall slid open without a sound. The Slytherin common room. The space was long and rectangular. Silver-green drapes hung from the ceiling. One wall was made entirely of enchanted glass, revealing the depths of the black lake beyond. The giant squid drifted past at a leisurely pace. Glowing jellyfish floated like ghosts. The fireplace burned with green flames that made no sound at all. The furniture was dark wood trimmed with silver, upholstered in deep green velvet. Portraits of famous Slytherins from past generations lined the walls, their gazes sharp and appraising as they studied the newcomers. Quite a few upperclassmen were already present. As the first years entered, every conversation stopped. Curiosity, indifference, and open amusement flickered across their faces. Lucretius stopped by the fireplace. "You're free to move about. The first-year dormitory assignments are posted on the wall over there." The new students surged toward the parchment lists. Regulus didn't hurry. He stayed where he was, calmly taking in the room. Then he heard his name. Not someone calling him. Someone talking about him. The voice came from the sofa area to the right. A group of fifth-year boys lounged there. The one speaking had black hair and a hooked nose, his smile sharp with mockery. Another black. Why not just head straight to the lion's den together? The boys around him laughed, not kindly. The common room fell quiet. Upperclassmen paused mid-conversation. Younger students held their breath. No one intervened. Everyone was waiting to see how this new black would respond. Regulus turned slowly to face the speaker. "Are you talking about me?" His voice was calm, not raised. The boy arched an eyebrow. "If you're Regulus Black, then yes." "I am." "I am," Regulus replied evenly. "So what do you want?" He'd expected someone to step forward. In fact, he'd been hoping for it. The boy stood. He was a head taller than Regulus. Fine silver embroidery marked the cuffs of his robes, the crest of the Traverse family. "I'm just curious," he said as he approached, unhurried. "Is this generation of blacks especially independent? Your brother chose Gryffindor. What about you?" He leaned in slightly. "How long do you plan to last in Slytherin? A term? Or until you find more interesting friends?" His followers laughed again, spreading out to loosely surround Regulus. Regulus's grey eyes met his without a ripple. "Mr. Traverse," he said, using the surname deliberately. "If I remember correctly, the Traverse family entered a marriage with a Muggle merchant in the 18th century to salvage a failing business." He paused. "That incident is recorded in Chapter 7, Section 3 of A Secret History of Pure-Blood Families. Would you like me to remind you of the exact passage? Your pride has a stain." The boy's face flushed scarlet. The whispers around them grew louder. Several upperclassmen exchanged glances. "What nonsense are you spouting?" the boy snapped, his voice shooting upward. "A Secret History of Pure-Blood Families, by Broderick Bode," Regulus replied, tone unchanged. "Citing original trade contracts and marriage registries. Shall I recite it?" The boy opened his mouth, then closed it. His hand clenched, knuckles whitening. Regulus looked at him and continued. "Of course, that's the past. What matters is the present. You mentioned independence. I don't see independence as a flaw. Blind obedience, on the other hand, is." His gaze swept the common room. Several of the boy's followers avoided eye contact. "Slytherin values intelligence. Intelligence means independent thought. Knowing what's worth pursuing, and what isn't. My brother chose his path. I chose mine. That's independence. And you?" Regulus looked back at the boy, his expression calm, the pressure unmistakable. "You chose to announce your existence on a first year's first night with cheap provocation. Is that your idea of independence?" Every gaze shifted from Regulus to Traverse. The boy's face cycled from red to pale to a sickly green. His hand shot toward his inner pocket, reaching for his wand. Regulus was faster. His wand slid into his hand and flicked lightly through the air. The space in front of Traverse twisted. An invisible barrier snapped into place. The instant his wand cleared the robe, it struck the barrier with a sharp clink, flew from his grasp, spun upward toward the ceiling. And froze there, motionless. A perfect interception. Regulus rotated his wrist. The wand began to descend, slow and controlled, as if held by an unseen hand. It settled upright at Traverse's feet, tip resting gently on the carpet. The entire exchange was silent and precise, without a hint of temper. "If you really want a match," Regulus said, pocketing his wand, "I suggest you start by learning how to hold onto yours." A few first years were on the verge of gasping. Regulus took a step forward. The companions exchanged looks and parted without a word. One older girl started to speak, only to be stopped by another, who shook her head. "Now," Regulus said. His voice was still quiet, yet everyone heard it. "Pick it up." Someone glanced toward Lucretius. The prefect remained completely still. Traverse's face looked ready to explode. Even his hair seemed to bristle. His body shook, his eyes burning with hatred. Regulus remained calm. Everyone else wore complicated expressions. A first year, making a fifth year unable even to draw his wand. Everyone understood what that meant. Strong. Not someone to provoke. And cruel. The humiliation was unmistakable. In that instant, the common room's impression of Regulus shifted, away from the one with a traitor in the family, to something far more dangerous. Regulus didn't need a wand to do this. But he had promised Orion not to act out of the ordinary at school. So he used one. Traverse's chest heaved. Just as some thought he might lash out, he suddenly bent down, snatched up his wand, and shoved his way through the crowd, disappearing around the corner toward the dormitories. His companions followed in silence, without even a parting threat. Regulus turned and headed for the dormitory list. The first years stepped aside to clear a path. This barely counted as a confrontation. It felt like bullying a child. Regulus found it dull. The boy had been weak and foolish. Regulus knew the encounter had been arranged on purpose. He didn't mind. In fact, he welcomed it. The common room stayed quiet until Regulus reached the wall. Then whispers resumed, tinged with shock. Several older students exchanged glances. A seventh-year girl with dark brown hair, wearing a rosier family brooch, murmured to her companion, "He's interesting." A boy from the Knot family nodded, his gaze lingering on Regulus. One proud-looking older student asked, "Did you see it?" Another girl with an elegant air nodded silently. The younger students were completely stunned. A first-year girl grabbed her friend's arm, whispering excitedly, "That just now, was that a nonverbal spell?" In first year. A round-faced boy swallowed. I think so." Regulus ignored them. He found his name on the list. First year dormitory A. Regulus Black. Cuthbert Avery. Hermes Mulciber. Alex Rosier. Chapter 15, I'm getting along with my roommates. The dormitory was down a corridor deeper inside the common room. The door was thick oak, marked with a single letter. A. Regulus Black pushed it open. The room beyond was spacious, 4 four-poster beds set in the corners with dark green hangings. Each student had their own desk area. From the windows, the black lake stretched out like a sheet of ink. 2 boys were already inside. Cuthbert Avery sat on the bed by the window, lining up his stationery with the sort of care that looked effortless. Blonde hair, blue eyes, chin tipped just slightly upward. When he saw Regulus, he gave a minimal nod. Black. Avery. On the bed farthest in, another boy sat with a copy of Curses and Counter-Curses in his hands. Black hair, pale face, shadows lingering under his eyes like he hadn't slept properly in a week. Hermes Mulciber glanced up once. His gaze was dark and unreadable, but he still inclined his head in greeting. Regulus set his trunk on one of the empty beds and began unpacking. Books went onto the shelf in timetable order. Quills and ink were placed neatly on the desk. Robes were hung in the wardrobe. The door opened again. The fourth boy stepped in, brown-haired with gray eyes and a mild expression. His robes were tidy, though not flashy. Alex Rosier. A branch of the Rosier family, with parents who worked low-level posts at the Ministry of Magic. Not as influential as the main line, but still pure blood. "Hi," Alex said, voice gentle. "I'm Alex Rosier." Avery glanced at him and gave a cool nod. "Avery." Mulciber didn't look up. Regulus said, "Regulus Black." Alex smiled, set his trunk on the last empty bed, and began unpacking. He was directly opposite Regulus. The air in the room felt careful. Regulus watched anyway, quietly sorting the pieces into place. Avery was the proud pure-blood core, the sort who wore his bloodline like a badge. Mulciber had the look of someone who lived half in the shadows and preferred it that way. Alex sat on the edge of that world, polite and mild, a pure-blood who hadn't grown teeth from it. Avery's eyes slid to Regulus. "Back in the common room, you made Traverse look stupid." Regulus didn't turn. He managed that himself. "His uncle's in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement," Avery said. "Not a small position." Regulus's tone didn't change. "And?" Avery's mouth twitched, amused, and there was something in his eyes that said, "I get it." "So," he said, "well done. The Traverse families always acted like they're better than everyone else. Funny thing is, who doesn't know their mess?" Regulus turned then, meeting his stare. Avery leaned back against his pillows, as relaxed as if they'd been friends for years. "My father says Slytherin needs new blood this year. People with real ability, not idiots who can only show off their family tree." His gaze sharpened on Regulus. "You don't look like an idiot." "What about you?" Regulus asked. Avery blinked. "What?" Regulus repeated it, calm as ever. "Are you an idiot?" Alex, who'd been sorting his things quietly, paused and lifted his head, watching without saying a word. For 2 seconds, Avery held Regulus's eyes. Then he said, evenly, "You'll find out." Regulus nodded once. "Looking forward to it?" Mulciber spoke for the first time, voice low. "That thing you did, knocking a wand spell away. How'd you do it?" Every gaze in the room shifted to Regulus. "Protego," Regulus said. "With a bit of technique." "What technique?" Mulciber pressed. Regulus didn't answer that. Instead, he asked, "You can cast Protego." Protego was not a first-year trick. It took control and intent, the kind you usually didn't see from children who were still struggling to keep a feather hovering without it wobbling. Everyone in the room came from pure-blood families. They all knew what it meant for a first year to do it cleanly. They also knew it didn't happen overnight. Mulciber went quiet. The way he looked at Regulus changed, but it wasn't awe. It was assessment, with suspicion threaded through it. Alex sucked in a breath. "My dad said only a handful of people at the ministry can cast it properly." Avery's stare sharpened. "My father said." Regulus cut him off. "Why don't you say what you think?" Avery froze like he'd been slapped. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. What was he supposed to say? No one had ever asked him that. In the Avery household, his father's opinion was law. In pure-blood gatherings, elders set the rules of reality. Even in Slytherin, older students' experience was treated like scripture. Avery had learned to borrow authority. To quote it, repeat it, hide behind it. And now, with one question, Regulus had peeled it off him like a cloak. Something hot and unfamiliar crawled up Avery's spine. Shame. He realized he'd been using his father's name as armor and the boy in front of him had seen straight through it. Avery inhaled, steadying himself, forcing his chin higher like he could hold himself up that way. "Protego needs precise control," he said, and his voice wasn't as smooth as he wanted it to be. And clear intent. The first comes from practice. The second comes from will. He swallowed, kept going anyway. Most first years can't even keep a feather floating without it shaking. His eyes stayed on Regulus. So you're not most first years. Regulus nodded, accepting that. Then you aren't either, he said. Avery blinked. If you can see that much, Regulus went on, you've got judgment. You're paying attention. That's not nothing. For a beat, Avery looked like he didn't know what to do with that. Then he let out a short laugh, like he'd surprised himself, and shrugged, sinking back against the pillows again. Fine. Across the room, Alex Rosier had been holding his breath the entire time. He looked from Regulus to Cuthbert, wide-eyed with confusion and a twist of unease. In Alex's home, in that careful, courteous Rosier branch that never stepped out of line, nobody spoke like this. Not so direct. Not so sharp. He admired Regulus's calm. He also found it unsettling. He doesn't feel 11, Alex thought, watching Regulus with the vague dread of realizing someone your own age is moving through the world with a completely different set of rules. He feels like those department heads at the ministry who walk fast down the halls and never waste a word. Tonight, he decided, he was writing to his parents. He wanted to know what was going on with the Black family's second son. The room fell into silence. Hogwarts's first class for the Slytherin first years was potions. In the wizarding world, potions was a kind of measuring stick, how careful you were, how precise, how patient. Slytherin liked to pretend those were its natural virtues. At the very least, that was the story. The potions classroom was in the castle's lower levels, a little higher than the Slytherin common room but just as cold. The air had that damp stone bite to it, laced with old fumes and something herbal that never quite faded. By the time Regulus stepped inside, most of the students were already seated. Long tables were lined up in neat rows. Each station had 2 cauldron stands, a basic tool set, and a pile of ingredients waiting like a dare. He checked the seating chart. Slughorn had clearly put thought into it. Slytherin and Gryffindor shared the lesson, but the seats were interwoven instead of split. Either it was meant to encourage house unity, or it was meant for entertainment. Regulus's seat was in the 3rd row. His partner was a Gryffindor girl with blonde hair and freckles. She was flipping through magical drafts and potions. When he sat down, she looked up, eyes brightening. You're Regulus Black. I am. I'm Mary MacDonald. The words spilled out quickly. I heard yesterday on the train you made James Potter's spell vanish. News traveled fast. Regulus nodded once, leaving it there. Mary practically lit up at the confirmation. You should have made James Potter vanish too. I've heard they're awful. Regulus blinked, a little surprised. So James already had a reputation. And if that was true, Sirius had probably helped build it. Mary didn't say more with Regulus right in front of her, but the point was clear enough. Even Gryffindor students were starting to get sick of it. She looked like she wanted to ask something else, but the classroom door swung open before she could. Horace Slughorn swept in. He was round and rosy, dressed in a dark green robe heavy with gold embroidery, the buttons over his stomach pulled tight like they were under protest. His presence filled the room the way perfume did, loud, rich, impossible to ignore. Ah! Welcome, welcome. Slughorn boomed, all theatrical warmth. Welcome to the world of potions, the most delicate, most dangerous, and most rewarding of the magical arts. He reached the front, planted both hands on the desk, and beamed at them as if he'd personally invited each student. I am Horace Slughorn, your potions master, he announced. And for the next 7 years, or at least until you've taken your O.W.L.S, I will be guiding you through the wonders that can be found in a cauldron. His eyes drifted over their faces, lingering here and there as though he were taking notes. "Some of you may have heard of me," he went on, smiling wider. "Some of you may have heard of my little club." A ripple of interest stirred through the room. "But I assure you," Slughorn said, voice bright, "in my classroom, what matters is your skill and your focus. Most of all, your love for the craft." Chapter 16, Choosing Sides. The end result of Potions class wasn't a mystery. When Professor Horace Slughorn called time and told everyone to bottle their work for inspection, Regulus Black's vial looked like it belonged on an entirely different table. Around it, other bottles were questionable. Some were the wrong color. Some were cloudy with bits still floating inside. A few burbled with suspicious little bubbles, like they couldn't decide whether they were done brewing or about to explode. Only Regulus's potion sat perfectly clear, a pale green that caught the light like something clean and alive. When the liquid settled, there wasn't even a hint of sediment. Slughorn picked it up and held it to the torchlight for a long moment, his round face openly delighted. "Exemplary," he announced, voice booming off the dungeon walls. "Mr. Black, this is well past acceptable, it's excellent. Tell me, did you use some special technique?" "I just treated the ingredients properly, Professor," Regulus said, calm as ever. He didn't sound like he was showing off. He sounded like he was reciting facts. "Snake fang powder needs to dissolve completely. The tip of the porcupine quill carries the strongest concentration of magic. And the fluxweed's balancing effect has to be timed precisely." Slughorn's eyes brightened. "You mentioned where the magic is most concentrated. Is that something you observed yourself?" "Yes, Professor," Regulus said. "By sensing the faint magic the materials give off." Whispers flickered through the room. Sensing an ingredient's magic? Was that something a first year was even supposed to be able to do? Slughorn didn't push. He just gave Regulus an approving look and nodded once. "Come to my office after class, Mr. Black." Afterward, Regulus spent 10 minutes in Slughorn's office. The professor was warm and expansive, showing off shelves of rare ingredients with the pride of a collector. He hinted, not very subtly, at the existence of the Slug Club. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he handed Regulus a small vial of Felix Felicis as encouragement. It was diluted, but even so, for a first year it was an unbelievable gift. "Keep that talent sharp, my boy," Slughorn said, patting his shoulder. "Potions isn't only nimble hands, it's sensitivity. You've got that." Regulus thanked him and slipped the diluted Felix Felicis into the inside pocket of his robes as he left. Used well, it could save your life. Used badly, it could create problems you'd regret. Transfiguration was held on the second floor in a bright classroom with wide windows. Sunlight spilled across the desks, and the air smelled faintly of wood and parchment. Professor McGonagall was already waiting at the front. She wore a dark green robe, her hair pulled into a severe bun, her expression as sharp as her posture. "Transfiguration," she began once everyone was seated, "is among the most complex, most dangerous, and most elegant branches of magic. It requires precise incantation, clear intent, and an understanding of matter itself." She lifted her wand and tapped the desk lightly. A matchstick became a silver needle. "Today, we start with the basics," she said. "Match to needle." Matchsticks were passed out. Students began to try. The room quickly filled with mumbled spells and frantic wand movements. Most of the matchsticks only twisted and warped, turning into awkward little things that were neither match nor needle. Regulus picked up his matchstick and studied it. Stable structure. Wood fibers arranged in a predictable pattern. A sulfur tip with its own composition. Shape, density, balance. Transfiguration didn't create something from nothing. It changed what was already there. Rearrange wood into a metallic crystal structure. Convert the sulfur into a silver point. Keep the object continuous, whole, instead of tearing it apart and pretending it was fine. He raised his wand and spoke softly. He barely tapped the matchstick. It shivered once on the tabletop, then the change began, gradual and smooth. The brown wood lightened into silver white as the grain vanished and the surface turned sleek. The sulfur head shrank, reshaped, sharpened. 3 seconds. When it was done, a perfect silver needle lay on the desk, straight as a drawn line, the eye cleanly formed. McGonagall happened to reach his table on her circuit. She stopped, looked down, then picked the needle up and held it to the light. Perfect transfiguration, she said, and there was a trace of surprise in her voice. One attempt. No repeated corrections. No residue. Mr. Black, have you practiced this spell before? I practiced the principles, Professor, Regulus replied. But this is my first time using it on a matchstick. The principles. The stability of material structure, Regulus said, taking the opening without hesitation. And conversion efficiency. He paused, then added, Professor, may I ask a question? McGonagall's brow lifted slightly. Go on. What are we actually changing? Regulus held up the needle. We turn a matchstick into a needle, but in the process, what changes? Is it the object's essential nature, or only its outward form? If it's the first, is the match truly a needle now? If it's the second, how is it different from an illusion? The classroom went quiet. Even a few students still wrestling with their matchsticks looked up. McGonagall's focus sharpened. She studied him for a few seconds, then said slowly, that is not a question most first years think to ask, Mr. Black. I still want the answer, Regulus said. McGonagall set the needle down and moved to the front, turning to face the class. Mr. Black has asked something important, she said. The core difference between transfiguration and illusion is material continuity. An illusion creates an image without substance. Transfiguration guides existing matter to reorganize along a magical path. She picked up another matchstick and tapped it. It became a feather. This feather, she said, holding it up, was a matchstick. The material foundation did not vanish. It was rearranged. That is why true transfiguration requires an understanding of what you are changing. You must know how wood becomes feather structure, and you must guide that conversion, not simply alter appearances. Her gaze returned to Regulus. Does that satisfy you? Partly, Professor, Regulus said, inclining his head from his seat. But it leads to another question. If transfiguration is matter reorganized, then what about the vanishing spell? It makes an object disappear entirely. Where does the matter go? Or is vanishing an extreme form of transfiguration, turning something into nothing? This time, even McGonagall went still. The room held its breath. Students stared at her, not even sure what the question meant, only aware that it was the kind of thing you didn't usually ask a teacher on the first week. McGonagall drew in a measured breath. The vanishing spell is N.E.W.T level material, she said at last, each word precise. It involves the conversion of matter and energy, as well as theoretical magic across dimensional boundaries. Her eyes didn't leave him. Focus on the task in front of you, Mr. Black. Your match to needle is excellent. 5 points to Slytherin. She turned back to the rest of the room and resumed her instruction. For the remainder of the lesson, Regulus could feel her gaze touch down on him now and then, brief and assessing. Regulus stayed quiet. He already knew the answer to his own question. What interested him more was the difference in McGonagall's response compared to Slughorn's. One encouraged. One watched. It was a kind of line being drawn. A choice of sides. When transfiguration ended, Regulus had only just stepped out into the corridor when someone blocked his path. Narcissa stood near the corner, her long blonde hair catching the sunlight until it almost seemed to glow. As a seventh year, she carried herself with a practiced elegance. Her dark green school robes were pressed perfectly flat, and the silver Slytherin badge at her collar shone like it had been polished that morning. Regulus. Cousin Narcissa. Come with me, she said. We need to talk. She turned into a quieter side passage. Regulus followed. Narcissa stopped and faced him. I heard about last night in the common room, she said bluntly. You humiliated a Traverse boy in front of everyone. He asked for it? I know, Narcissa said, and there was a hint of approval under the sharpness. He is an idiot. His father's ministry position came through marriage connections, not ability. That isn't the point. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. The point is that you showed too much, Regulus. First day. First night. In front of all of Slytherin. Do you understand what that means? Regulus met her eyes, steady. It means I'm not easy to push around. It means you're on certain people's radar, Narcissa corrected. Earlier than you expected. She glanced around once, making sure they were alone, then continued, quieter still. At breakfast, Robistan Lestrange asked about you. You know him, Rodolphus's brother. He had questions. What training you've had. How strong your magic is. What you think about certain things. What things? Regulus asked. Narcissa's stare hardened. You know what things? Then she said it, crisp as a verdict. He's paying attention to talented young wizards. Especially purebloods. Your brother's betrayal dragged the Black family down in his eyes. But now you've appeared, younger, more gifted, and you look like you fit what he wants from a Black. Chapter 17, You Can Do That. Narcissa's expression tightened, her tone turning sharp and serious. Bellatrix already knows. She'll contact you soon, either by letter or she'll come to Hogwarts herself. She'll test you, size you up, and then decide whether you're worth recommending to Voldemort. Regulus was quiet for a few seconds. So what's your advice? He asked at last. Rein it in, Narcissa said. At least in public. You can show talent, but not like that. At Hogwarts, especially with a professor like Slughorn who collects gifted students like trophies, your name will spread fast. And when the wrong people hear it, it brings trouble. She paused, eyes steady on his. Or opportunity, depending on what you want. I already have, Regulus thought. And that was the point, even if it was still early. At 11, you were only good for being observed. Even Voldemort wouldn't send an 11-year-old to do anything real. He wasn't some warlord scraping together child soldiers. Narcissa's voice softened a fraction. I'm not saying this to scold you. You're smarter than I am, Regulus. I've known that since you were 5. But smart people trust themselves too much. They stop watching what's around them. Regulus nodded. Thank you for the warning, cousin. But I have my own reasons. I knew you'd say that. Narcissa sighed. Fine. Just remember, last night isn't over. Traverse won't let it go. He probably won't come after you himself, but he'll send someone. Older students, or his little pack. That's how Slytherin works. I'll welcome it, Regulus said, and with Narcissa, someone he could be slightly less guarded with, the words came out almost casual. Narcissa studied him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. You know, she said, sometimes I think you and Sirius are actually alike. Not the face. Something deeper. That reckless streak. He uses it to rebel. You use it for something else. She turned to leave, then stopped again. One more thing. Lucius Malfoy is interested in you, she said, and her mouth tightened. Not in that way. If he asks to see you, be polite. And be careful. Regulus nodded once. I know, he thought. Your fiancé. Regulus turned toward his next class, History of Magic with Professor Binns. It would be the easiest lesson of the day. Dash. By Friday, the Scottish Highlands sky was washed clean and bright. On the flying practice grounds, 20 broomsticks lay in a neat line. Every one of them was old and uneven, the kind of battered school equipment Hogwarts had clearly been using for years. Madame Hooch stood at the front, short grey hair ruffled by the wind. Her eyes cut over the first years like she was measuring who would break something and how quickly. All right, everyone, stand on the left side of your broom, she barked. Right hand out, hold it over the broom, and say it clearly. Up. They did as told, and the lawn filled with uneven shouts. Up. At the front of the Gryffindor line, a red-haired boy with freckles, probably a Weasley, snapped his broom straight into his hand almost instantly. He grinned like he couldn't help himself, earning impressed little noises from the students near him. On the Slytherin side, Cuthbert Avery's broom rolled a half-turn on the grass before it grudgingly lifted. He clicked his tongue, irritated. Hermes Mulciber tried twice. On the second attempt, the broom leapt up so sharply it nearly smacked his chin. Regulus lowered his gaze to the old clean sweep at his feet. Up, he said, voice level. No coaxing, no hesitation. The broom trembled. It seemed to think about it for a second, then rose into his open palm. Good, Madame Hooch said, striding between the lines. Weasley, quick reflexes. Now listen carefully. When I count to 3, you'll kick off gently and rise 1 foot off the ground. Hold it there. No higher than my shoulder. 1, 2, 3. Chaos arrived right on schedule. Brooms shot up. Girls shrieked. Boys yelled like they were daring gravity to try them. At least 4 brooms jerked too high, and 1 Gryffindor girl clutched the handle as she squealed. Madame Hooch snapped her wand up, slowing her and guiding her down before she could panic herself off the thing. Regulus hovered at exactly 1 foot, steady as a fixed point. His body barely moved. Only the hem of his black robes lifted and fell in the cold wind, slow and rhythmic. Merlin's beard, a lanky Gryffindor boy named Benji Fenwick muttered to his friend. Look at that Slytherin. He's so steady it's like he's glued to the air. Not far away, a brown-haired Gryffindor girl, Sarah Bones, noticed too. Her own hovering was decent, a slight bobbing like she was riding a gentle current. But Regulus was something else entirely. No wasted motion. Every shift of balance looked deliberate, as if he already knew exactly how the broom would respond before it did. Eyes forward, don't look down. Madame Hooch shouted, wand flicking as she corrected students who started spinning in place. Now try moving forward slowly. She demonstrated a soft, pressing motion with her hand. Feel how the broom responds. Treat it like a living partner. The lines began to drift, awkward and scattered. Most first years wobbled along crooked paths, speeding up and slowing down without meaning to. Regulus slid forward about 15 feet, speed constant, line straight. At the next instruction, he turned left smoothly. Ha! Show off. A stocky Gryffindor boy with thick eyebrows grumbled loudly. His broom was swaying in uneven arcs, and the contrast with Regulus's control was almost insulting. He is flying better, Alphard, the girl beside him said, matter of fact. Better like a block of wood, Alphard said louder, making sure the wind carried his words toward the Slytherins. Stiff as a statue. Flying takes guts. A few Gryffindors snickered. On the Slytherin side, Cuthbert's brow furrowed. Hermes shot Alphard a dark look. Alex Rosier watched Regulus with nervous concern. Regulus acted as if he hadn't heard a word. Alphard Pruitt's face darkened. When the lesson moved into its second half, Madame Hooch told them to practice basic control on their own while she helped the students who were really struggling. The class immediately broke into small clusters across the field. Alphard deliberately guided his broom toward the edge of the Slytherin space, two friends flanking him. "So, Black," he called, hovering a few feet away, "does your family train you to ride a broom like a statue? Gotta keep that noble image, right?" Cuthbert pushed forward at once. "Watch your mouth, Pruitt." "I'm talking to Black, Cuthbert," Alphard shot back, chin tipped in challenge. "Or does he need someone else to speak for him?" Regulus turned his head slowly. Grey eyes, calm as still water, settled on Alphard. "Pruitt," he said, not raising his voice, "what are you trying to prove? Gryffindor bravery? Or Pruitt manners? A Slytherin brat lecturing me about manners?" Alphard's voice rose with anger. Regulus only looked at him, letting the silence stretch until Alphard's face started to redden. Then he asked, quietly, "Do you have any?" "That did it?" Alphard's pride flared hot and stupid. If he didn't do something, he'd be a joke. He yanked out his wand. His two friends, Colin Macmillan and Gareth Diggory, followed immediately, wands pointed toward the Slytherins. "Want a fight?" Cuthbert drew his wand almost at the same time, his face tight with caution and a thread of excitement. Hermes's wand slid into his hand without a word. He drifted forward half a broom length, shoulder to shoulder with Cuthbert, eyes dark. Alex went pale. After a second of hesitation, he lifted his wand too, though his aim was clearly more toward empty air than anyone in particular. Alphard shouted, "Expelliarmus!" Regulus's wand lifted. "Expelliarmus!" His spell snapped out faster, cleaner. Two red jets met midair and collided with pinpoint accuracy, bursting into a spray of sparks. The disarming charms cancelled each other out. "What?" Alphard blurted. He wasn't the only one. Students nearby stared, frozen. "You could do that with Expelliarmus?" Chapter 18, Can I Switch Dorms? Farther off, a few Slytherins who'd been practicing nearby noticed the scene and immediately drifted closer. 3 became 5, 5 became more. Alphard's expression shifted. His two friends, Colin and Gareth, exchanged a tense look. At that moment, Regulus raised his left hand. He didn't turn around. His back was to every Slytherin present. Palm upright. Fingers together. A crisp, unmistakable signal to stop. Cuthbert froze. His wand, half raised, sagged but didn't lower all the way. Hermes narrowed his eyes, staring at Regulus's back. His wand stayed up, but the tip began to drift aside. Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The Slytherins who'd gathered hesitated. Their brooms hovered, motionless in midair. No one pressed forward. Regulus didn't look back. A faint, knowing smile touched his lips. A compliance test. Slytherins were proud, brooding, cautious, and prone to following the current. And now, without a word, they had obeyed him. Getting them to move as one wasn't easy. But once a single person stopped, the rest followed naturally. It traced back to the first night of term, when a fifth-year traverse had been utterly crushed. Authority had been established. Across the way, the Gryffindors who'd started to gather also halted. Eyes flicked between one another, the tension thick but restrained. "What's wrong, Black?" Alphard said, forcing calm into his voice. "Afraid your little helpers will embarrass you." "On the contrary," Regulus said, sounding genuinely puzzled. "I'm worried they'll act too fast and you won't get the chance to show your courage." "Expelliarmus!" Alphard snapped, red light firing again. This time, Regulus didn't even speak. His wand lifted slightly. A faint glimmer struck the strap binding the front of Alphard's broom. Reparo. A first-year spell. The sort used to fix chair legs or mend torn robes. Click. The strap tightened abruptly. The broom's nose dipped hard. Alphard's disarming charm shot into the ground as the broom lurched, blasting a small crater in the sand. He yelped and clutched the handle, barely avoiding being thrown off. Reparo, on the strap, a Gryffindor blurted out. Incredible, a Slytherin shouted. Colin rushed to back Alphard up. Rictusempra. A streak of silver shot toward Regulus's side. Regulus didn't even glance at him. His wand angled down to the left. Aguamenti. Water sprayed across the ground beneath Colin's broom. Mud splashed as the earth turned slick. The old clean sweep still had wheels. They sank straight into the muck. The broom jolted to a dead stop, and Colin's spell veered wildly off course. From the other side, Gareth tried to catch Regulus unaware. Stupefy. This time, Regulus looked at him. Just once. His wand tapped the ground near Gareth's feet. Incendio. A small flame sprang up in the dry grass. Gareth's broom had a woven wicker base. Fire was the last thing it wanted near it. He panicked, yanking upward, and his spell went wide. 3 directions. 3 attacks. Regulus answered each with the most basic spells imaginable, never targeting a person, only the environment and the brooms themselves. Balance shattered. Spells missed. Once was coincidence. Twice was luck. 3 times was a crushing difference in skill. Alphard's face went white. He'd barely stabilized his broom when Regulus's voice reached him. Do you want to keep going? Regulus asked calmly. Or would you like to demonstrate something else? The surrounding Slytherins stared, stunned. He never attacked anyone, a Slytherin girl whispered. He only hit the brooms and the ground, a boy murmured. That's worse than getting hit. And those spells, another added, incredulous. They're all from the first 30 pages of Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1. I don't believe for a second that's all he knows. Cuthbert watched Regulus's back, expression tangled. He knew every spell Regulus had used. He just couldn't imagine using them like that. Hermes quietly lowered his wand. His gaze lingered on each precise impact point, every choice maximizing effect while minimizing effort. Then a furious shout cut through the field. What do you think you're doing? Madame Hooch stormed in like a gale, her face dark as thunder. Wands down. Now. Alphard and the others hurriedly pocketed their wands and jumped off their brooms, sweat streaking their faces. Pruitt. Macmillan. Diggory. Madame Hooch barked. Using spells during flying class. Against fellow students. Gryffindor loses 30 points. 1 week's detention each. But, Professor. Alphard protested. He used spells too. What spells did Black use? Madame Hooch demanded, sharp eyes locking onto Regulus. Reparo, Professor, Regulus said evenly, meeting her gaze. To reinforce a strap. Aguamenti to reduce dust on the ground. Incendio to dry wet grass. Madame Hooch studied him for several seconds, then the ground, then the broom. The strap was indeed tighter. There was water on the earth. Scorched marks on the turf. Pruitt, she said coolly, are you accusing Black of attacking you with a mending charm? A few stifled snickers rippled through the crowd. Alphard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Another 10 points from Gryffindor, Madame Hooch said flatly. For making a false accusation. Now get inside. All of you. As the Slytherins left, nearly every student who passed Regulus slowed, eyes lingering on him. Surprise. Respect. Approval. Slytherin valued power. It valued intelligence in using it even more. That night, in the Slytherin common room. Green flames crackled softly in the fireplace, casting light over dark drapes and silver accents. First years clustered around the sofas, the afternoon's events the undeniable focus. "Why didn't you let us step in?" one boy finally asked Regulus. "We had the numbers." "We could've." "Could've what?" Regulus cut in, lifting his gaze to the group. "Given Gryffindor grounds to appeal." "All of us jumping in," he continued quietly. "Attacking 3 Gryffindors together." He set down his quill. "Slytherins lost the House Cup 3 years in a row. Every 10 points can decide the outcome. Was it worth throwing away dozens?" Silence followed. House points hit Slytherin harder than most. The younger the student, the more they cared. "And besides," Regulus went on, "if you'd joined in, it would have been a brawl. When Madame Hooch arrived, she would have seen Slytherin surrounding 3 Gryffindors. Instead, she saw 3 Gryffindors attacking 1 Slytherin," someone finished softly, "and that Slytherin wasn't even fighting back. Just fixing a broom, cleaning the ground, and drying the grass." A few people laughed under their breath. Regulus scanned the room. Some older students had started listening in. He raised his voice slightly. "And the result?" He stood, addressing the whole common room. "Gryffindor lost 40 points. Slytherin lost none. Pruitt and the others are in detention until next week." His chin lifted, energy creeping into his tone. "And we gained respect. Madame Hooch saw Slytherin's restraint and discipline. The other houses learned that provoking Slytherin has a price." At that moment, Prefect Lucretius Burke stepped over. He looked down at the younger students. "Impulsiveness, mob fights, reckless point losses," he said coolly. "That's Gryffindor's way. Slytherin seeks victory, advantage, and glory. Today, Black showed how to strike hardest within the rules, while taking the least damage in return." He turned to Regulus. "You earned respect for the house and avoided a disastrous penalty. Well done." Several older students nodded. The first years stared at Regulus with a mix of awe and envy. So soon after arriving, and he already had a prefect's public approval. Regulus inclined his head. "I only made the choice that benefited the house most." Back in the dormitory, Cuthbert paused mid-essay and looked up. "You did it on purpose," he said. Regulus returned an amused glance. "Did what on purpose?" Cuthbert wasn't like some of the brainless purebloods. He thought. Hermes also lifted his head from his book, watching Regulus closely. He'd felt it too. Something had been off earlier. Regulus didn't wait for Cuthbert to elaborate. He turned to Hermes instead. "You were thinking of casting at me," Regulus said calmly. Hermes's eyes tightened. The thought had crossed his mind, just for an instant. He noticed that. Was that a bluff? He stayed silent. Cuthbert narrowed his eyes, looking between the two of them. Alex held his breath, doing his absolute best to remain unnoticed. "Can I change dorms? This place is terrifying." Chapter 19, Charms. The Charms classroom sat on the 7th floor of the castle. Its windows faced east, and when the morning light slanted in, you could see dust motes drifting lazily through the air. Regulus sat in the second row of the Slytherin section. To his right was Cuthbert Avery. One seat to his left sat Alex Rosier. Alex was nervously flipping through Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1, murmuring the pronunciation of the levitation charm under his breath. "Relax, Rosier," Avery said with a sideways glance, his tone edged with mockery. "Professor Flitwick isn't going to eat you." "I just want to make sure I say it right," Alex muttered. The classroom door creaked softly as it opened. Professor Phileas Flitwick all but floated inside. He was so small that he had to stand atop a stack of thick books to see over the lectern. But once he settled there and those bright eyes swept across the room, the chatter died instantly. "Good morning, children." Flitwick's voice was high but clear. Today, we'll be learning one of the most fundamental spells in magic, the levitation charm. It looks simple, but it carries the essence of spellcasting itself. He flicked his wand, and a white feather drifted out of a box on the lectern, hovering in the middle of the classroom. Now, repeat after me, Flitwick said, raising his wand. Wingardium Leviosa. 3 things to remember. A smooth, arcing wrist motion, stretch the gar, and on the final essay, release your breath gently. A feather lay on every desk. Uneven chanting filled the room. Regulus lifted his wand slightly. Wingardium Leviosa. His voice was steady. His motion precise. The feather rose slowly, steady as if suspended by an invisible thread. It hovered in front of him without the slightest tremor. Perfect. 5 points to Slytherin. Professor Flitwick nearly hopped off his stack of books as he hurried over, craning his head to study the feather. Look at that stability. Not a hint of wobble. Mr. Black, have you practiced this before? The same question Professor McGonagall had asked. I just listened carefully to your explanation, Professor, Regulus said modestly. Excellent. Simply excellent. Flitwick exclaimed, his small hands fluttering. Mr. Black, perhaps you'd be willing to demonstrate for the class. Of course. Regulus inclined his head. He let the feather drift down, then cast the spell again. Wingardium Leviosa. Under dozens of watchful eyes, the feather floated up once more, stopping at exactly the same height. Observe the movement, Flitwick called out. Pronunciation matters, but so does the wand motion. Remember, an arc. Regulus guided the feather back onto the desk, then looked up. Professor, may I ask a question? Ask away, my boy. Ask. I was wondering, Regulus said, when the levitation charm acts on an object, does it strip away its weight, or does magic form an invisible support for it? If it's the former, does the object's mass still exist? If it's the latter, is the magical support evenly distributed, or focused on a specific point? The room went utterly quiet. Heads turned toward him. Most of them were only thinking about getting the feather off the desk. None had considered what was happening beneath the spell. Regulus's question felt like it was peeling back the charm's surface. Professor Flitwick adjusted his round spectacles, admiration flickering in his eyes. What a marvelous question. Very few first years think about magic at this level. He gave a light wave of his wand. Another feather lifted from the lectern, hovered briefly, then descended. The answer is that it's a bit of both, but the core lies in the balance between magic and mass. The levitation charm doesn't truly remove weight. Mass is intrinsic to an object, just as the soul cannot exist without the body. Magic cannot erase it. His wand tip pointed to the floating feather. A faint silver glow formed around it. What we do is act upon the object with magic. A wizard's magic repels gravity while evenly enveloping the object, like clothing it in a light cloak woven of magic. The support is distributed throughout. Only then can the object hover steadily, without tilting or spinning. Regulus nodded slightly, then pressed on. And if the object's mass changes? For example, if a drop of water lands on a floating feather, does the magic adjust on its own, or does the caster need to re-guide it? An excellent extension. Flitwick said, his voice rising with excitement. Magic is linked to the caster. When an object's mass changes, the magic senses it immediately and adjusts. But that requires the caster to maintain focus. The connection can't be broken. He looked at Regulus, smiling warmly. If concentration falters, the magic disperses. The object will either fall, or drift as the added weight pulls it off balance. The fact that you thought of this tells me you're not just casting spells. You're thinking. And that's the key to becoming a great wizard. Thank you, Professor, Regulus said sincerely. I learned a lot. Flitwick beamed up at him. Keep thinking like that. Another 5 points to Slytherin. Lo, excited chatter rippled through the Slytherin benches. Ravenclaws kept glancing their way as well. Regulus knew Flitwick's explanation reflected the wizarding world's traditional understanding. To him, it felt more like the interaction between magical and gravitational fields. Just not something he could put into words. Flitwick moved on to check other students' progress. The room filled again with overlapping chants of Wingardium Leviosa, feathers jerking upward, drifting crookedly, or refusing to budge at all. Alex Rosier had already tried 7 times. His feather either trembled in place or shot up into the ceiling before fluttering back down. On the last attempt, it even let out a thin wisp of smoke. "Stop for a moment," Regulus said. Alex jumped. What's wrong?" Regulus stepped beside him. Professor Flitwick said to draw an arc. "You're pumping your arm up and down. Watch." He rolled his wrist, the wand tracing a smooth curve. "Magic should be calm. You look like you're hammering metal." Alex's face flushed. I was afraid I wasn't using enough force." "The levitation charm doesn't need force," Regulus said, lowering his hand. "It needs precision. Try again. Smooth, continuous motion. Don't break it." He adjusted Alex's posture again and again. Alex wasn't stupid. Just nervous. Maybe that was what it felt like to be a gentle pureblood branch dropped into the heart of a true pureblood nest. Regulus considered it quietly. He needed people like that. Alex took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a few seconds. Wingardium Leviosa. This time, his wrist traced a passable arc. The feather wobbled, lifted 2 inches off the desk, hovered for 3 seconds, then fell. "I did it." Alex's eyes lit up. "Not bad," Regulus said with a nod. "But there's still resistance. You weren't decisive enough. Keep practicing." Alex nodded hard, gratitude written all over his face. Maybe Black wasn't that scary after all. Regulus returned to his seat. Avery leaned over and whispered, "You're far too patient with him." Regulus glanced at him. "Avery, do you know why on the Black family tapestry, next to the names that were burned away, there are often a few obscure ones left behind?" Avery frowned. "Because they're from branch families. Not important enough. Because when the main line made foolish choices, it was the branches that preserved the bloodline," Regulus said evenly. His gaze drifted across the room, as if selecting idiots at random. "And you can't guarantee the main line won't produce fools." A few purebloods nearby snickered. The half-bloods and Muggleborns looked over, puzzled by the laughter. Avery fell silent. "And besides," Regulus went on, his voice low but carrying just far enough, 30 years from now, when we look back on Hogwarts, we won't only remember who made a feather fly the highest, or who flew the steadiest. We'll remember who sat beside us in class, who copied homework with us, who talked about dreams after lights out." The words drifted to Professor Flitwick as he passed. The small professor paused. He looked up at Regulus, something flickering in his eyes. His mouth opened, as if to say something, then he simply tapped the lectern lightly with his wand. "Best to write your own homework, Mr. Black." The classroom erupted in laughter. Chapter 20, A Different Slytherin. The defense against the dark arts classroom on Tuesday afternoon smelled faintly of old leather and dust. Regulus sat in the third row of the Slytherin section, watching the professor at the front of the room. Galatea Merrythought, who liked to introduce herself as a former adventurer, was currently waving her arms with great enthusiasm as she explained how to identify and avoid Grindylows in marshlands. "And remember, children," Merrythought declared. "If you see bubbles rising to the surface and hear a chittering laugh, retreat immediately. Grindylows love dragging lone witches and wizards underwater." She flourished her wand, conjuring a hazy outline of a water creature in the air. Clearly, there would be no live specimens today. Tom Riddle, Regulus thought. All because he hadn't been chosen as defense against the dark arts professor, he'd placed a curse on the position. From that point on, no professor lasted more than a year. Some met with accidents. Some were forced to resign. Some vanished outright. A childish, cruel sort of revenge. What made it even more absurd was that the curse seemed to have genuinely affected the quality of teaching. Maybe the professors subconsciously knew the post was cursed and simply went through the motions. Or maybe they were afraid that the better they taught, the harder the curse would strike. Regulus glanced back at the lectern. Mary thought was demonstrating how to use lumos to drive off shadowy creatures lurking in dark corners, but the light flickered unevenly, as if reflecting her own lack of focus. First-year material was shallow to an almost insulting degree. Identify a few low-level dark creatures. Learn basic defensive gestures. Memorize safety rules. All of it was covered in the first 2 chapters of Dark Forces, a guide to self-defense. The rest of the time should have been spent on practical responses. But there was no practice. Mary thought didn't teach it, and the students didn't seem to mind. If anything, they were pleased. A useless class was still better than a difficult one. Self-study would get them further than this. The library was perhaps the quietest place in Hogwarts. There were no shrieking first years here. Regulus nodded politely to Madame Pants at the entrance and received a severe nod in return. He went straight to the section on magical theory and history. Since starting school, his physical conditioning had continued to improve, with impressive results. But he'd begun to sense a bottleneck. The body was a vessel for the soul. He could make the vessel larger, stronger. But if the water inside didn't increase accordingly, it was nothing more than an empty shell. Pointless. A wizard's power came from magic. And according to mainstream theory, magic originated in the soul and was expressed through mental will. So could the mind itself be trained? He stopped in front of a bookshelf, eyes scanning the spines. Most of the books dealt with meditation, mental focus, and introductory acclimacy. The content was basic, but the direction was right. Regulus pulled out a thin volume titled Consciousness and Magic, an examination of ancient meditative practices. The parchment cover was worn. He opened it and saw the first chapter heading. Wizards change reality not through magic, but through will. He read on. Ancient rune wizards believed that magic was a bridge, connecting the inner world to external reality. A powerful will could cross that bridge and leave an imprint on the real world. Weather magic alters the skies. War magic twists the environment. At their core, these are expressions of a wizard's will, forcibly rewriting reality through magic as a medium. Thus, the difference between strong and weak wizards lies not only in magical reserves, but in the strength, clarity, and resonance of their will. Resonance. Regulus closed the book, deep in thought. Why could some wizards cast advanced spells with ease, while others struggled with something as basic as the levitation charm? Beyond age, knowledge, intelligence, and raw magic, what else was there? His thoughts turned to Dumbledore, the greatest white wizard of the century. Regulus knew he was especially skilled in transfiguration. Canon never stated it outright, but Regulus believed Dumbledore could change weather patterns, reshape terrain, and perhaps even more. When magic reached that level, wasn't it will rewriting reality? And Voldemort, his magic was another extreme. More like tearing. The Cruciatus curse tore pain from the body. The killing curse severed life itself. Even Horcruxes were created by ripping apart one's own soul. Those were questions for later, when he had the power to face them. For now, he needed a way to strengthen his mind. He continued searching, nearly combing through the entire shelf, until at last, on the lowest corner level, he found a small booklet with a faded cover. The title was barely legible. Astrological Meditation, Expanding the Mind Through Stargazing. The author's name was blurred, but on the title page, a handwritten note stood out. Those who gaze upon the stars are not bound to the earth. The paths of the stars are the universe's script. Imitate them, understand them, and eventually resonate with them. Resonance again. This was it. Black. A hushed voice came from the aisle between shelves. Regulus looked up to see Lily Evans standing there, arms full of books. On top was a practical analysis of common magical plant poisons. Miss Evans. Regulus closed astrological meditation and slipped it behind a thicker book. Hidden for now. He'd retrieve it later. Looking something up. Lily stepped closer, green eyes bright with curiosity. I heard you said something interesting in charms class. Regulus raised a brow slightly. What did I say? About memories of Hogwarts. Lily set her books down on a nearby table and rolled her sore shoulders. Someone said you told your classmates that in 30 years, what we'd remember most would be the people we copied homework with. It made its way to the Gryffindor common room. A lot of people thought it didn't sound like something a Slytherin would say. Did I put it like that? Regulus thought dryly. I said other things too. You just latched onto the homework part. That idea isn't limited to houses, he said. And it happens to be true. Think back to primary school. I mean Muggle primary school. What do you remember more clearly, your exam rankings, or the classmate who shared an umbrella with you on a rainy day? Lily paused, then laughed softly. The umbrella? First year, I forgot mine, and one of my friend pulled her big floral umbrella over. We both got half soaked, but we laughed all the way to the school gate. Exactly. Regulus nodded, a hint of a smile in his eyes. Magic doesn't change that. Wizards are still people. We just happen to have magic. Lily looked at him, visibly energized. You're not what I imagined a Slytherin would be like. Regulus met her gaze but didn't respond to that directly. Instead, he asked, do you know why the four houses attend classes together? Lily thought for a moment. So we can understand each other better. Partly. More practically, because after graduation, houses don't exist anymore. When you join the Ministry of Magic, your co-workers might be Slytherins. If you go to St. Mungo's, your healer could be a Ravenclaw. When you shop, the store owner might be a Hufflepuff. And if you become an Auror, the person you arrest might be a Gryffindor. Houses are labels for school. They're not brands burned onto you for life. Lily was quiet for a few seconds, then said softly, thank you for saying that. I'd never really thought about it. Everyone is different, Regulus said seriously. Houses are just rough categories. They shouldn't define everything. There are narrow-minded people in Ravenclaw. Ambitious ones in Hufflepuff. And in Slytherin. Lily picked it up with a smile. There are people who know how to share an umbrella. Regulus's lips curved faintly. Perhaps. Lily Evans had already been personally acknowledged by Slughorn as a prodigy in potions. Canon made that clear. Her talent rivaled Severus Snape's. Regulus's future path would require top-tier potion support. Some needs could be taken openly to Slughorn. But the more sensitive ones would demand a private, trustworthy collaborator. Slughorn was useful, but he was also an information hub. Any request could become gossip in his club. Snape could be motivated by benefit, knowledge traded for secrets, but that kind of relationship rested on a dangerous balance. The moment interests conflicted, it would collapse. Snape had never been a good man. A friendship built on mutual respect was far more stable. And Lily Evans herself was a keynote in the fabric of this world. In the future, she would serve as a bridge between eras. A success story for Muggle-borns. The mother of Harry Potter. The emotional core of many tragedies and turning points. Building a friendship with her was like tying a thread of his own into the weave of fate. One day, when he needed a potion no one could know about, when he needed an absolutely reliable partner, Regulus was almost certain she would help him.